Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Kris Mackowski, and joining me is my partner in crime, ECW co-founder Kris White. Good evening, Kris.
Hey, good evening.
Good evening. So Kris and I have been to Mobile, Alabama twice in the last 6 months.
No, speak for yourself. I've been there more than that, but go
That's
for it.
well, and you had scouting visits, and you had red carpet from the people in Mobile.
I'm an unofficial Mobilian.
And I was just so impressed by the city. I didn't know what to expect, and having never been there. And I was so impressed by the city, by the history, by the whole terrain. And you had been regaling me about, just the red carpet treatment the Visitors Bureau was giving you and the great experiences you were having at the history places. And I tell you, like, Mobile is a Civil War gem.
Yeah, I think that it's important to say we are not being paid by Visit Mobile. And it's an awesome place. And our friends down there, Jerry, he really, like you said, rolled out the red carpet. And to give people background, I run a program for the American Battlefield Trust for our teachers. And every year we put on a teacher event and we move around the country so that folks get different history, and folks from the upper north can come to the deep south and vice versa as we move around the country. And back in November of 2018, I went down to Mobile for a scouting trip because we were narrowing it down to a few cities along the Gulf Coast, and went over to Mobile, and within, I think I told you, 20 minutes, I was won over by not only the city, but the people. And because you're putting on a major event there, you have to go back a number of times. So, I knew all the restaurants, got to know the people, actually met the mayor. Like it was, they really treated me very well. And then when the trust had the event down there, treated everybody, I think, very well. And it's a really interesting city. I think sometimes it's forgotten because New Orleans is down the road on one side of it, about 2.5 hours to the west, and then to the east you have Pensacola, to the north you have Birmingham and everything. So Mobile's just this really cool gem, founded in 1702, but then it moves downriver to where it is today around 1711, and it's the home of Mardi Gras. They're very proud to say that New Orleans didn't have it first because we came here before New Orleans. New Orleans is founded about a decade after, almost 2 decades after Mobile is originally founded. So, just a cool place, lots of Civil War history. I think people don't understand that, how much Civil War history is down there. They know one action and really one quote: "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead." And then, I think it's just a cool place if you ever get a chance to visit.
Yeah, it was so far into the deep South, and there were so many other pressing objectives that the Civil War really doesn't kind of close in and focus on Mobile until relatively late in the war. And boy, a lot gets crammed into those last few months, though.
Yeah, I mean, Mobile in Alabama itself is a very interesting case study for Civil War historians, and I don't think a lot of people actually pay attention to it enough because, like you said, so much happens late in the war. You'll have the Battle of Mobile Bay, which takes place in August of '64. Mobile Bay is sealed off. The city doesn't fall until April 12th, 1865, which is a few days after Lee surrendered at Appomattox. You had the battle at Fort Blakely that took place same day as Lee surrender. You also had the battle at Spanish Fort. There were some other minor actions and things around there, but almost everything happens later in the war because the city proper isn't one of the more important southern cities to take off the map. Now, it's important because of the blockade running. It's important because of Mobile Bay, but the city itself is not a large industrial center. There are items coming in from, the center part of the state being shipped down towards Mobile, going out into different parts of the Confederacy. One of their major supply depots is not too far away from Mobile, but Mobile plays into the Civil War because there's 3 railroads running through it at the time of the war, and one of the largest troop movements of the Confederacy, moving Braxton Bragg's army from basically out in Mississippi down through the very deep South, through Mobile, and then north up towards Chattanooga for what becomes the Heartland Offensive in 1862, the Perryville campaign. It's really because of railroads and because of the bay that gives it some importance, but that bay can't be sealed off until 1864.
So, and of course, the last surrender east of the Mississippi takes place just outside of Mobile in Citronelle. You've got some
Beautiful
interesting,
Citronelle. I know
I know,
you
beautiful.
traveled up there. You were like, I'm going to Citronelle. I'm like, really? You're going to Citronelle? All right.
It poured rain on me like cats and dogs. And then there's like one sign and an abandoned Boy Scout camp.
Yeah, that's about
But
it.
yeah, yeah, there is a little museum in Citronelle itself, a little in the railroad station, but it was closed on the rainy afternoon that I showed up there. But just some, interesting characters, Farragut and Richard Taylor, and you just get a lot of people passing in and out through the story of Mobile. So, as far as its strategic importance, what made Mobile a place that the Federals were even looking at all?
Well, ironically, again, Mobile falls April 12th, 1865. The city formally surrenders. Excuse me, but you have to back up to the New Orleans campaign of 1862. David Farragut, David Dixon Porter, and others, Ben Butler, they're going to start focusing on the efforts in the very deep South to cut off the mouth of the Father of Waters, and that is the Mississippi River. So they cut up the Mississippi about 95 miles and they take New Orleans. As soon as New Orleans falls, which is April of 1862, Farragut basically is going to tell the War Department as well as the Navy Department that, okay, next is Mobile. Because if you look, and Kris has seen me do this before, if you actually put your hand like a claw, you actually can see how the Gulf of Mexico is going to go around the Gulf Coast here. And you'll have New Orleans on one side, you have Pensacola on the other side, Pensacola Bay, and then in the middle is that next natural bay, which is Mobile. So the idea for Farragut is, hey, let's go take out Mobile. Pensacola actually is largely in federal hands by April of 1862. The Civil War almost started there in Pensacola, Florida. The Federals never give up a place called Fort Pickens. Confederates will take many of the forts down there, like Fort Barrancas. They'll also take the Naval Yard. But by May of 62, the Confederates have to abandon Pensacola. So in May of 1862, Pensacola falls fully into Union hands. Now you have New Orleans fully in Union hands, and now in the middle is just Mobile. So to put this puzzle together, let's go take on Mobile. But ironically, the Federal High Command says, nah, Mobile is just not that important. We have other things to do, namely clear out the rest of the Mississippi River. We have to make sure that the Father of Waters flows unvexed to the sea, and that's what they're going to more focus on, sealing off the approaches along the Mississippi River. They'll start moving up towards Memphis. Memphis has its own D-Day on June 6th, 1862, and then they'll keep moving up, and of course to Vicksburg, Port Hudson, and other places throughout 1863. So they focus more on Mississippi or the Mississippi River. They felt that was more important than taking out Mobile Bay, which was largely the home of blockade runners at this point. And quite frankly, Mobile was home to a large Unionist population, as was a lot of Alabama. And that's probably something we should discuss at some point. It's just the secession of Alabama is completely different than other deep southern states, specifically South Carolina.
In fact, because of that secession, there may have actually been an act of domestic terrorism that was sort of tied into that vote and how we sort of remember that. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we would call that today domestic terrorism. If you look at John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, whenever he takes over a federal arsenal and kills people, it's not exactly a raid. That was what we would call an act of domestic terrorism. And the Governor Moore of Andrew Moore of Alabama starts to kind of do that as well in January of 1861. So when South Carolina secedes, when they start to go in for secession in late 1860, it's basically a unanimous vote. Everybody's all for it. The hotheads have won out. Everyone's, oh, here we go. We're going to war. And then Alabama starts to think about seceding, and Governor Moore's like, yep, absolutely, let's go to secede. But when secession is called, or at least the convention for it, the vote is 61 to 39. 61 in favor, 39 against. And only 54% of the population came out to vote for their candidates who would, or representatives who would vote for or against secession. So, this state, barely half of the registered voters came out to actually vote for people who would vote for or against secession. In fact, because so few people came out, there's a push by cooperationists in Alabama to have another vote. Like, hey, let's go and have this second vote to make sure we really want to do this. And there's a vote to have a second vote, and that fails. And so they have this secession. Secession goes through, and the cooperationists are people who don't want to cooperate with the Union per se. They want to cooperate with other Confederate states. They're worried that if South Carolina secedes and goes to war, they'll easily be picked off, or Florida does this, or Mississippi, or whatever. What they want to wait for is to see what the upper South is going to do, like Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina. Where are they going to go? So they will cooperate together when secession comes about. And so when we start to look at Alabama, there's these cooperationists who want to work with others. They don't want to just go off to war. You have these other people who are saying 39, candidates who go off to the secession convention are like, no, we shouldn't secede. And in fact, up in Warren County, at a place called Looney's Tavern, there's another little group that gets together and says, you know what? We don't want to be part of the Union. We don't want to be part of this Confederacy. We'll do our own thing. And that doesn't stick. But, it's very split state on should they secede or shouldn't they. And as the war goes on, North Alabama is heavily Unionist, and then Unionists in the Deep South and the deeper part of the state can actually go to Pensacola and hang out there because that's a Union stronghold. It's a place to go. So you have all of this stuff happening. And to your point about talking about what Governor Moore does, and in early January, Alabama doesn't secede until January 11th of 1861. But a few days prior, he's actually going to take his militia, move them to take Fort Morgan. He's also going to take Fort Gaines, because Mobile Bay is vast. Most people think that Mobile, the city itself, sits right at the mouth of the bay. It doesn't. It actually sits about 32 miles straight north of the opening of Mobile Bay. So once you get into massive Mobile Bay, you got to go another 30 plus miles to actually get to the city and to get up to the docks. So at the mouth of the harbor, or Mobile Bay, you'll have two fortifications, both built by the United States government. One's called Fort Morgan, named after Daniel Morgan, the Revolutionary War hero, and then one named after Edmund Pendleton Gaines, who is a War of 1812 hero. So that's Fort Gaines, Fort Morgan, and then a third fort named Fort Powell, later named Fort Powell, will be down along this area of Mobile Bay. And that's what's going to protect the mouth of the bay and the entrance and exit points. So Moore sends a force down there to take these forts. This is before they've actually formally joined the Confederacy. This is before the states actually seceded. So this is an act of domestic terrorism, and, it's an act of war, really. To add to it, Florida, which is just down the road, if you drive from Mobile to the Florida line, it's less than an hour. It's an easy drive down I-10. He also, Governor Moore does, sends a group of his militia to the Florida-Alabama line, basically to coerce Florida, if they don't join the Confederacy, to join the Confederacy. So this guy's going for broke. I mean, he's taking federal installations. He's threatening a sister state. Even though some folks might not be for war here in Alabama, the governor definitely is. And he goes off to serve in the Confederate Army later on.
So, right from the very earliest days of the conflict, then we've got action happening at the mouth of Mobile Bay. Now you talk about the bay being 31 miles long, but of course ships can't just sail right up there past these forts and go all the way up to Mobile. I talk a little bit about how the geography really impedes federal efforts right off the bat.
Yeah, I think one of the things you have to think about Mobile Bay as it's a large drain. It's a large drain. And I don't mean that in any sort of a derogatory way. Basically, the water table in Alabama flows south into Mobile Bay. The delta that is up near the city that is at the top part of Mobile Bay. That delta is more than 200,000 acres. It spans for, it has more than 200,000 miles of inland waterways. It has the Tombigbee River, the Tensaw River, the Mobile River, all coming together. It's home to, like 130 species of mammals and like 80 species of birds, all kinds of things. So it's a big wetland, and that's all draining down from, if you think of Selma, Birmingham, all that starting to come down into the top of Mobile Bay. Once it forms into this delta, that's a tough area to move around, even to this day. I mean, we've been up there. You can go eat on the causeway near Mobile. You can see alligators right out there with you. It's a really cool experience. And then you get to the bay and it opens up. It's massive. The first Europeans to lay eyes on it happened in the early 1500s, and those are the Spanish, as the Spanish are coming along the coast, looking for natural inlets, looking for gold, looking for other things. But it's the French who will eventually settle, and they don't settle in what is Mobile today. They actually go 32 miles to the south. So Mobile Bay flows for about 32 miles, and then at any one point, it could be as far as 20 miles wide. I mean, this thing's massive. It takes you hours to drive around the bay. If you don't take the ferry between Dauphin Island and Gulf Shores at Mobile Point, man, it's going to take you forever to get around the bay. We had that happen to us when we missed the ferry recently. So it all comes down here. You got this massive bay, and then you have these little barrier islands. And the barrier islands are what are going to protect the bay itself, basically from Mother Nature, but as well as warships, and that's where the fortifications are placed. And most people think when you look at Mobile, that the ships will go through the Gulf of Mexico and they'll shoot up through the bay, up and come back down. Well, in early days, a lot of times, like to get from New Orleans to Mobile, they would use an overland portage from New Orleans, go up Lake Pontchartrain, Lake Bourne, and then go across using the Gulf Islands to protect them on one side and the mainland on the other. So they're not actually out in the Gulf, and they come through Mississippi Sound, slip through Grants Pass, and then make their way up into Mobile Bay, at least from the west to the east. So it's a really cool place whenever you look at it geographically. So you have these barrier islands to the south. You have what looks like a large bell almost, or a bell if you look at it on a map, and that's the bay itself. And then to the north of it, you have this massive delta. And this all forms a very interesting ecosystem, but also a very tough place to settle for the French, and as well as to do trading, because the original port of Mobile was actually down at Dauphin Island. That's where they did a lot of their trading. Then they eventually build Mobile itself at 27 Mile Bluff. That's not a great place to set up, so they move it about 10 miles down to where it is today, around 1711, sitting on the northwestern bank of Mobile Bay, right at the mouth of the Mobile River.
And just to add one additional complication, about 10 miles south of the city is the Dog Creek Sandbar. It's got, it's only about 8 feet deep at low tide, so ships can't get all the way to Mobile. They have to stop, use smaller boats to get cargo over the sandbar, then reload them onto larger ships and take them up. Now that channel is dredged, but that's what prevented any warships from just sailing right up and taking the city itself. So lots of different geographic and topographic features at play here in the bay.
Yeah, now, when the French first arrived, they can't even get over the sandbars. Their ships are too large, so they need these little lighters, they call them, to take goods and things over the top of the sandbar and get them off of Dauphin and head up towards Mobile, the old town as we would call it today. I mean, it's an interesting thing, and you really need to look at a map, because my description may not have been the best description, doing it off the cuff here, but it's a massive bay. I can't tell you just how big this thing is until you actually see it or experience it or take the ferry across, and it's really cool. It's a great place to go.
Yeah, it's beautiful. So you mentioned Farragut captures New Orleans, and he wants to go back to Mobile, and he's told no. Vicksburg falls in July of 63, and Grant wants to start looking at Mobile, and he's told no. So finally, Farragut gets to go back, but it's not until 1864. What brings Farragut finally back to look at Mobile?
Well, we're starting to run out of targets of opportunity for the United States Navy. By the time Mobile comes under the guise of the eyes of the United States Navy, We really only have two deep water ports that are still fully operational for the Confederacy. There are blockades going on, obviously part of the Anaconda Plan. And you have Wilmington, which is the home of most of the blockade runners coming down the Cape Fear River, and then heading out towards the guns of Lake Fort Fisher. Um, and that's probably the more famous of the ports. And then you have Mobile, which is the other one where you could send ships out into the world if you're the Confederacy. Remember, war is about, military actions, but it's also about economics. And part of those economics is trying to strangle the Confederacy's way of doing war, and as well as making money and getting goods out to the world and back to them. So that's what they're starting to run into. It's just targets of opportunity. And even though the battle takes place on August 5th of 1864, you have a long buildup to it. So Farragut finds out, fairly early in 1864 that Mobile will come under under the federal guns, but it's going to take a while to put together the fleet that's going to need to go and take Mobile Bay. And, it takes time to pull together 4 monitors, ironclad warships. It's going to take time to get, some of his squadron up there. You also have to deal with, shipping goods to the different islands that are around to make sure you have coaling stations at this time. And so it takes a little bit of time to prep. And Farragut, once he realizes that he's going to get his chance to go in, he doesn't think outside the box. I mean, he uses the similar tactics that he will use on the Mississippi River, taking larger ships, lashing them to smaller ships to give them cover, but also to make sure that they keep up, the whole fleet keeps up, and then just basically let's haul ass and run past these guns like of a fort. And I mean, I'm not going to say it's a bad plan, but it didn't work for him on the Mississippi every time he did this. So there was a fear that this might not happen, or might not happen properly, along the banks here of Mobile Bay.
I know that as the Army looked at it, they predicted it would take some 20,000 men to take Mobile. And because the Overland Campaign has been drawing a lot of resources over the course of the summer, a lot of the Federals that might have taken place in the Battle of Mobile are actually drawn up into Virginia and over toward the Atlantic Campaign. So that really leaves the Federal Army shorthanded, but that Army-Navy cooperation does become really important as Farragut unfolds this plan. Tell me a little bit about how the infantry gets involved in this.
So I think that something that's overlooked are those combined operations between the Army Navy during the American Civil War. Overall, the American Navy as well as the American Army worked together pretty well. I mean, believe me, they didn't get along all the time at meetings, but when push came to shove, if you start looking at like the landing down at Fortress Monroe for the Peninsula Campaign, you look at Burnside's efforts on the North Carolina coast, you see what happens at Fort Fisher, at least the second battle of Fort Fisher, things go much better with the Army-Navy landing, and then you see New Orleans, and now we're going to look at Mobile. There's a pretty good track record of these two sides working together. So operationally, you're going to have David Glasgow Farragut is the most famous guy who's going to take place in this battle, probably for the North. Good luck for most people who don't know about the Civil War to even name a officer fighting for the Confederacy down here. We'll go through those guys in a minute or two, but I mean, good luck. And then on the Federal infantry side, you have Gordon Granger. If you're a real Civil War loser like we are, you would know that Gordon Granger served at Chickamauga. It's probably his most famous action prior to the battle at Mobile Bay, and that is at Chickamauga. He is going to be in charge of the Reserve Corps that will come up and try to help Rosecrans as Rosecrans' army is being defeated at Chickamauga in September of '63. So Gordon Granger, what's going to happen is you're going to have these 3 principal forts that will be defending Mobile Bay, the opening of Mobile Bay, as well as a pass from Mississippi Sound up into the bay, and that is called Fort Powell. So Fort Powell will be kind of to the northwest of Fort Gaines, sitting out today, where there's if you go across the big bridge that'll take you from Little Dauphin Island to Big Dauphin Island, off to your right will be Mississippi Sound, and then you would have the fortification out there, which was blown up by Confederates during the battle, giving part of the story away. Then you get to the tip of Dauphin Island, and that was also once known as Massacre Island by the French. And then they wondered why nobody would. Yeah, they wonder why nobody will come and settle here. Why would no one come to this place? Oh, we should change the name. Then so you have Fort Gaines. Fort Gaines is a third system fort, which has a lot of problems. It has a lot of problems from the time its construction started around 1821. It's not even finished whenever the Civil War starts because it flooded repeatedly. Then the federal government somehow didn't own the land technically that they were building on, and there's this tax thing that goes on, and then finally they start really building it. And it's a really neat place you can visit today. I really recommend it. It's a great site. But even though it boasts, I think, 26 outward-facing seaward guns, only one can actually reach across Mobile Bay in support of its sister fort, and that's Fort Morgan, which is 3 miles straight across the mouth of the bay, which is the tip of what's called Mobile Point over on Gulf Shores. And over there, you have Fort Morgan, a very impressive fort that's run by the Alabama state park system. I think they have 46 guns there, and those guns can largely cover the mouth of the bay, and then not completely taking up the whole channel. There are obstructions that will be like basically wood pylons so that ships can't go through the mouth of the bay. And then there are, more importantly, what we call mines today. At that time, we call them torpedoes, which were laid out into a torpedo field or a minefield. So there's a very narrow channel. The Confederate blockaders know how to move in and out of their blockade runners. And the idea of having the obstacles as well as the torpedoes is actually to force all the ships that can come through the navigable channel to be as close to Fort Morgan as possible. So what they're trying to do is narrow the channel, push all those boats as close to Morgan, because that's the more powerful of the two forts at the mouth of the bay, and it has more guns. And that's the place where you want to go. It's been in Confederate hands since January of '61. At one point, it had about 1,500 guys at its peak. In fact, the first Alabama soldier to die in the American Civil War died at Fort Morgan. He fell off of a dock. He drowned. He was found 3 days later. And then that will be the idea. By the time of the battle, there's, I think, somewhere around 600 guys at Fort Morgan. Prior to the war, William Tecumseh Sherman served there between 1841 and 42. He's the commissary officer down there and quartermaster officer, and it's a boring post. I mean, it's a long drive to get down to Fort Morgan to this day. So if you were down there in 1862, 63, 64, you're not only battling boredom, you're dealing with sand lice. There's a lot of sand lice you have to deal, or sand fleas, I'm sorry, sand fleas. You have to deal with sand blindness. That's a real thing because it's beautiful white sands down along the Gulf Coast, but it can create sand blindness, heat exhaustion. They have to install cisterns and different water collection systems because fresh water is not available down there. It's not a great post. I mean, it's a beautiful place to go today. People are like, I want to go to the Gulf Shores. It's awesome. Like, you don't want to be stationed there in 1840s and 50s and 60s. It's just not, it would look beautiful for about 10 minutes. And then it's like, man, what did I get myself into?
Yeah. It's probably worth noting that the garrison that was there got assigned over to Pensacola, which is why it was essentially vacant when the Alabamian militia took it over. So that's why that didn't trigger the Civil War right there, because there wasn't actual fighting at that moment.
Yeah, that the fort itself of Fort Morgan was built from between 1819 and 1834. It was completed in 1834. It is the third most expensive third system fort, I believe. Fort Monroe was number one. The second one, I can't remember, it was number 2, and then number 3 is Morgan. It cost them just over $1 million to build at the time. It has 30 million bricks that it's created out of. You're going to have slave labor that's utilized down there, rented. Essentially, these humans rented from the slave owners, brought down there to work. You'll also have the U.S. Army building this thing, and I think battery uh, let's see, company, it's the second U.S. Artillery, Company B, I think, will man it initially. It's named in 1834, or 1833, and before that, it's known as the Mobile Point Construction Project. Doesn't have a name, and then they name it Fort Morgan.
And it is worth driving down to see. You know, we've talked
Totally.
about the interminable drive to get there, but it is worth it because it is an impressive structure to get out there. And
Stop at Tacky Jack's along the way. Believe me, if you're looking for a restaurant, it's the only restaurant, and it's Tacky Jack's, and it's a great place to stop and eat. I love Tacky Jack's.
So Farragut decides he's going to try to run the guns, get up into the bay, and cause a little havoc. He lands Gordon Granger just to the west of Fort Gaines.
Yeah, because I didn't answer your question. I think I just went off on one of my tangents. Sorry about that.
No. And so Farragut first has to get up into the bay and then provide a little help for Granger. The two don't happen at the same time. And one of the things I find fascinating is because Farragut's got all this, years, decades. I mean, between he and the Confederate commander there, they've got 100 years of naval service between the two of them. And, so Farragut waits until dawn and the tide's going in so that helps carry the ships. He waits till the breeze is blowing in a way that's going to blow the artillery smoke back on the fort itself to provide him with some additional cover. So he's got all these great little tricks. And then he's going to then sort of deploy his monitors and his wooden ships sort of in a pattern that's going to get him in, support each other, and to get past those guns. You said it's not a especially creative plan, but it does end up working, although there's some glitches. Tell me about his decision to, basically run the gauntlet.
Well, let me step back for a second and actually answer your first question that you had with me that I just completely blew past because I was just brain dumping on you. So the idea is to run past the guns. So he's going to set 4 monitors close to the Mobile Bay. Those are ironclads. They're not all called Monitor. They all have different names, like the Tecumseh. But there are the Monitor class ships that you might know from the Monitor versus Merrimack. So those 4 ships are going to lead the way. They're going to turn up, and the idea is that they can get in close range and have their heavy guns blast away at Fort Morgan, and also being that their iron sides are impenetrable at this point, that should give them cover. And then following up will be the USS Brooklyn, which will be in the lead, and the Brooklyn will be the following the ironclads will be the Brooklyn, and that will be a wooden warship. We would call it a hybrid today. It has steam, it also has sail. And the reason the Brooklyn's in the lead, and it's not the USS Hartford, which is the flagship of David Farragut, the Brooklyn actually has an anti-mine sweeping device attached to its bow. That's the only reason why it's chosen. So the Brooklyn is sent forward to hopefully either push away the mines and open up the channel for the rest of the ships, or, if the mine does detonate when it hits, that it'll be far enough away from the Brooklyn and other ships to be okay.
I think it's important to point out that like Farragut knew that there were mines out there. It wasn't like this was a big surprise.
Oh yeah, I mean, when you're sitting there for basically you have the West Gulf blockading squadron sitting out there since 1861, you have nothing else to do. You're just watching. I mean, they probably watched them put the mines in, and it is important to remember the mines had been out there for a while. That'll be very important in a moment. Then, as the Navy is running the guns, at the same time, a few days earlier, you had Gordon Granger and his force of approximately 10,000-ish federal soldiers, including a large number of USCT troops, United States Colored Troops. They're going to be moving down Dauphin Island to within 1,000 yards of Fort Gaines. So they're going to pin down Fort Gaines so it can't support Fort Morgan at the same time, and hopefully take Fort Gaines. On a landward side, I mean, really, Fort Gaines can't do anything to really help Fort Morgan. They're 3 miles away, and that's a big problem. And then once Farragut gets into the bay, he does have another problem he's going to have to deal with, and that is an actual Confederate Navy. Who said that? The Confederate Navy? Wow. So you have actually 4 Confederate ships, warships. Just to confuse you, one's named the Gaines and one's named the Morgan. So you have 2 different ones down there, 2 different things named Morgan and Gaines. You have the Selma, the CSS Selma, and then you have a very underpowered but over-armored CSS Tennessee, which is a ram. which is boasting, I think, 6 or 8 Brook rifles. And these are some of the best rifled cannon in the Confederacy. But the CSS Tennessee has a big problem. It's actually created in the South. It's brought down into Mobile Bay. So this thing's built. It's not like the Merrimack that was pulled up and then rechristened the CSS Virginia. Confederates build this thing. It's got heavy armor on it. It's got the guns, but its steering apparatus is actually exposed. And the power plant that's powering it is severely underpowered. Then the Confederates find out that their friction primers that they made are absolutely terrible. And friction primers are a long piece of brass with a little twisted braid on the end of it. And inside of it is a chemical compound called a fulminate of mercury. When you go to fire the gun, what you would do is you would pull the lanyard, fulminate of mercury would go down into the that would ignite whenever you pulled it. This fulminate of mercury, this chemical compound, would actually ignite like striking a match almost, and it would go right down into the barrel, the breech of the gun, and then in theory it will ignite your gunpowder, have your chemical reaction, and then that would send the ball down range. Only one of the Brook rifles actually works because these friction primers are so terrible, the Confederacy, that they can only fire one gun at a time because that's how poor it is. But it's also a ram. So the CSS Alabama or CSS Tennessee has a ram on the front of it. And rams go back to ancient times, and all it is a big iron spike coming out basically just below the waterline, and that is to ram into a ship. And this happens, we see rammings all the way up into World War II of major warships. So this is what Farragut's going up against. He's got 3 forts. You got Fort Powell off to the side. There'll be a naval force going on against it. You'll have Fort Gaines, where you have a army force going to take that out under Gordon Granger. Then you have Fort Morgan, and that will be the focus of Farragut's fleet until they enter the bay, and then they know they have to deal with the Confederate fleet that is down in there, which is basically an undersized fleet led by Franklin Buchanan. He becomes famous for the first day of the action, March 8th, 1862, during the Battle of Hampton Roads. And that is whenever he's wounded, whenever they take down the Cumberland and the Congress and things, and he hurts himself. He's not there for the Monitor and the Merrimack the next day, but Buchanan is the highest ranking sea admiral in the Confederate Navy. So that answers that question for you. And then Farragut's plan goes into action around, like you said, right around the tides changing, winds are coming in. So Farragut sends in his ironclads, and he starts to send in his first ships. And things do not go well initially for Farragut. The guns of Morgan are powerful and they're real. And when you're standing on top of the parapet of Fort Morgan and you look out and you can see the buoy markers out in there, and it's like, man, that's how close they were. I mean, we're talking for a naval action near point blank range. The advantage that the Federals have, amongst other things that you pointed out, having the tide with them, having the wind, they do have the advantage too of having to fire at a stationary target, whereas the fort has to wait and time they're firing. But it's not a textbook maneuver by any stretch of the imagination, but like you said, it worked.
And Farragut tells everybody, avoid the torpedoes. When we get in there, we're going to engage the Confederate ships. And it seems like the Tecumseh got both of those orders confused, and in an effort to go after the Confederate Navy, forgot to avoid the torpedoes.
Yeah, so the famous phrase, damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead, which Farragut may or may not have said, or he may have said something like that. He may have said this might be a, kind of a conglomeration of a few different quotes. As the Federal fleet goes in, and the Tecumseh actually arrived to the Federal fleet the day before the battle. Farragut had been waiting a long time to get these monitors. Finally, the Tecumseh shows up the day before the battle, August 4th, and then the next day, the 5th, they go into Mobile Bay. And as they're pushing into Mobile Bay, what you start to see is the narrow channel. And Richard Page is in charge of Fort Morgan. Richard Page, like I said, go figure out who's actually here for the Confederate Army, is actually an old sea dog himself. and he's a cousin of Robert E. Lee. And Page has been down there for a while, and at first his guys really like him, and they one of them has a great quote to paraphrase him. He's like, "Yeah, he seems like he's going to do a great job," and then a few weeks later, he's like, "Yeah, he comes up with some really idiotic ideas, and the only way to get that idiotic idea out of his head is whenever the next idiotic idea comes up." So he doesn't. They don't have a lot of love for Page, but Page is going to put up a really stout defense. I mean, his guns are going to be firing as quickly as possible, and he's going to push he's going to start to push the Tecumseh kind of out towards the left. You'll have a number of ships, and there's a whole line of it, but you have the Tecumseh, the Manhattan, the Winnebago, and the Chickasaw, which are all ironclads. So as they start to push forward, as they start to go past the guns, off to the left of the Federal Navy will be the minefield, and off to the right will be Fort Morgan as they're kind of going to the north. And as they start to go in, Tecumseh fires its first shot. You know, they started off around 6:30 in the morning. It'll be a little bit later before they fire their first shot. And as they fire their first shot, you know, they're actually going to, you know, do a little bit of damage to the fort. But Commander Craven of the Tecumseh starts to actually move forward and start to move towards the CSS Tennessee. So he sees the CSS Tennessee, and the Tennessee is, you know, really a prize if you can take the Tennessee. It's also kind of like, man, can we take this big thing out, this big hulk, this Confederate ironclad? And the Tecumseh, as it starts to go left just slightly, hits a mine, and the mine explodes. And it hit the one part of a monitor that was actually vulnerable, and that was the underbelly. So when the mine goes off or the torpedo goes off, it's actually going to rock the ship, and then that is going to force water straight in. And within just a few minutes, 92 sailors, including its commander Craven, go down with the ship. And there's actually a buoy marker out there placed by the United States Navy, and it marks the sea grave of those sailors of the Tecumseh. And the Tecumseh is still there at the bottom of Mobile Bay. I think it's about 30 feet down.
And
And
it amazed me how close to shore that was. I mean, I know that
very close.
the shore has shifted over time, but it's right there. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I said it. It's very nearly point blank range. You know, it seems to be almost point blank range, and the pilot of the ship left a really good account. So it's not the only ship to go down. I think the Philippi goes down as well, which is a kind of a supply ship. But it's the most famous is the Tecumseh. So when the Tecumseh goes down, I mean, this is an ironclad going down. And when it sinks, it's just a few minutes. And Craven is walking up, the commander of the ship, he's walking up to the ladder to climb up and get out of the ship. And the pilot walked up to him and he said, "Pilot, after you." And the pilot climbed up, and he says, as he looked back, he saw that everything was filling with water, and that's what took down this ship, including the commander. So the commander let the pilot go, and he was the last one off of the ship. When Richard Page, the Confederate commander, looked out, he saw the ship go down. I mean, you couldn't miss this explosion. And he saw a number of small launches go out from the Federals. And the Confederates started picking off these launches, basically long rowboats. And Page quickly realized what was going on, and he told his men to not fire at those ships, that they were going out there to try to save the sailors of the Tecumseh. You know, this is one of those, I think, you know, if he wasn't once a Navy man himself, I'm not sure he would have given those orders, you know, because I don't think a land commander would have initially realized what was going on. Now, when this happens, the next the main ship up ahead that we're gonna count on is the USS Brooklyn, if we are David Glasgow Farragut, because the Brooklyn is leading the main fleet in. It's one of those hybrid ships, like I said. It's got sails, it's got steam, it's got that cow catcher on the front of it, which is the mine sweep. And at this point, its commander, James Alden, is like, "What the heck do I do?" And he stops. And Farragut, who's in the next ship behind him, is going to start signaling forward to keep going, keep going, keep going. And the Brooklyn actually starts to back up towards the rest of the fleet. This is how panicked Alden has become. And Farragut, at least twice, climbs into the rigging of the ship, and twice has to be strapped to the rigging of the ship by its commander, Percival Drayton. Drayton's going to tell men, get the hell up there and strap that guy down. He's going to fall down. I don't want to lose the admiral over the side. And at some point, Farragut's up in this rigging. He's looking out. He's screaming out orders. He's trying to get the Brooklyn moving forward. And he is going to scream something along the lines of, damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead. And that's whenever you get the famous, that famous naval quote. And it's partially in reaction to the minefield, and it's partially reaction to the Brooklyn, who won't get the heck out of the way. And they start going forward. This
and that's really,
sorry.
That's really important because, we talk about this bay being 3 miles wide, but we only have a very narrow channel to move all these ships through. So if things stop, that's a terrible bottleneck.
Yeah, and that's what's happening here. Now they're right under the guns of Fort Morgan. They're coming in from the side. And what makes it worse is we have such a narrow channel. Now this forces the rest of the Federal fleet, at least the front part of the Federal fleet, towards that minefield. And there are numerous accounts of Federals who said that their ships went up against those mines, touched the mines, and could hear the detonation device go off. Essentially, they could hear the snap, they said, of the detonator go off, but they didn't explode, which shows that most likely these mines were in the water too long. Just because you put them in the water, these mines in the water, doesn't mean that they're going to be fully waterproof forever. And it's almost a fluke that the Tecumseh hit one that actually exploded. So these sailors can hear these things scraping up against their hulls. They can hear the snapping of these detonation devices. And it's just like, man, at any moment they thought they could go up, and they don't. Now, there will be other ships sunk later in Mobile Bay by some torpedoes, but the Tecumseh is the one that goes down during the battle. But because of the determination of Farragut, he's able to push into Mobile Bay, and by 8:30, his men have run the guns of Fort Morgan and actually have gone into the bay, have stopped, have kind of got into this little harbor, if you will. They create a little flotilla inside of the bay. And then he orders his men to eat breakfast because they're out of the range of the guns of Morgan. And he feels that he has some time before he can go and finish off the CSS Tennessee, as well as the other Confederate ships that are in the area.
And those Confederate ships don't just roll over. I mean, Buchanan, who's commanding one of them, he starts to charge after Farragut's men, Farragut's ships. But the numbers really don't weigh out for the Confederates at all here. It's a pretty lopsided confrontation between all these ships.
Yeah, Farragut is gonna be sitting. He'll be on the Hartford. Things have gone, pretty well for him, and he has lost to Tecumseh, and there are some problems. But he looks out, and somebody says, "Here comes the Tennessee." And Farragut looks out and said something along the lines of, he never thought that Buchanan, old Buck, was that stupid to charge in with one ship against his fleet. Because I can't remember how many ships Farragut has in all off the top of my head, but between Grant's Pass and between here, he's got more than 20 ships. So here comes the Tennessee, trugging along, underpowered. I got one gun to fire. I got a ram, but I have a lot of armor, and that's what Buchanan's gonna kind of figure out. That's what he's gonna weigh on or lean on. And as they charge forward, Farragut's like, all right, here we go. And he starts sending his ships out and orders the men to stop having breakfast. And he just started to contain the Tennessee. He's actually gonna have it rammed by the I think the Lackawanna rams it. I also think the Monongahela rams the Tennessee. And in fact, fast forward to the end, the Tennessee, after about 4 hours, is going to surrender. And whenever the Federals get onto the ship, they go to look and see where they had rammed the ship, and they said they saw no noticeable damage. That's how well this thing was built. And I mean, they pound this thing for hours. And eventually Buchanan, just like in the Battle of Hampton Roads, he's wounded, his leg's broken during the battle. He has to turn over command to Commander Johnston of the Tennessee, and it's a forlorn hope that he was going to go out there and finish off the federal fleet. But many of the federal commanders, the U.S. Navy commanders, were fearful of this thing. They thought it was going to come and take them out, and rightfully so. I mean, the thing, if it was powered properly and it had the right guns on it, it could have wreaked some havoc. But poor poor Buchanan, he's on two just really underpowered ships between the Merrimack and / Virginia and the Tennessee, and it wasn't going to go well for him. The steering rigging was shot up, and because it's exposed, that's a real smart thing to do. Whenever you're an engineer, it's like, yeah, poor Confederate Navy.
The Gaines, their crew has to ground the boat and burn it down to avoid capture.
Yeah.
The Morgan sort of limps away and then slips away at night to escape, and the other ship surrenders as well. So not a good day for the ersatz Confederate Navy there.
It's one of the few times they come out to fight, and it's like, here we come, guys. It's like, yeah, it's like the bad news bears of the Navy, and just they tried, as my wife would say, they tried.
It still takes a while for Forts Gaines and Fort Morgan to fall. Things start over at Fort Gaines, and Gordon Granger is able to creep his men up. He's got some regiments from Ohio and Illinois and Iowa, as I recall. And
yeah, the 77th Illinois, I think, are the first ones to take Fort Gaines. 77th Indiana or Illinois. Useless information regardless.
And part of the problem there is that all of Gaines's cannons are pointed out toward the bay, so they don't have anything that can really shoot at Granger coming in from the landward side.
Yeah, so the way the bay falls is actually pretty easy, or the Confederate defenses fall. It's easy to follow, and maybe I can be succinct for once in my life. Federal Navy comes in, they run the guns in Morgan, they take out basically the Confederate fleet. Fort Morgan is still intact. They don't land any troops there at this time. They have Fort Gaines, which is now being pressed from Gordon Granger from west to east. He's moved across, and he's actually found some higher ground to fire down into the fort too as well. That doesn't help. And then you move up to Fort Powell, which is to the northwest of Dauphin Island, as well as Fort Gaines. At Fort Powell, there's ships out there. There's some Federal Navy is up there, and the commander at Fort Powell is a lieutenant colonel. His name's escaping my mind. Anderson's in charge of Gaines. I can't remember who's in charge of Powell, but he has orders to hold. And he writes down to Anderson down at Gaines. He's like, hey, man, what should I do? And Anderson writes back to him. He's like, if you hold as long as you can. If you don't think you can hold anymore, just get out. All right, I can't hold anymore. And he leaves two guys behind. They spike the guns, and they blow up the powder magazine. And that night, same day of August 5th into August 6th, Fort Powell's taken out. So Dabney Maury, who's in charge of all the defenses of Mobile Bay, I think he's a West Point graduate of 46. He's related to the Matthew Fontaine Maury, who's the Pathfinder of the Seas. He's also a Confederate Navy guy. Dabney Maury is in charge of all the defenses of Mobile at this point, and he's kind of like, hey, that was a really bad idea. And he tries to court-martial that commander at Fort Powell, and the guy gets off. Dabney Maury, there's a great quote about him of he was every inch a soldier, but there weren't many inches of him. Kind of a short guy. Our friend Mike Bunn reminded me of that quote not too long ago. So next, Gaines will fall. Just a few days after the Battle of Mobile Bay, Colonel Anderson is actually going to ask for terms. He's going to go out onto the Hartford. He's going to meet with David Glasgow Farragut, talk about the surrender of Gaines. At the same time, Maury's like, don't you surrender that fort. And then by the time that message had reached him, oh, by the way, we surrendered Fort Gaines. Next, we're going to land a force over on Mobile Point, or near Mobile Point of U.S. Army, and then we're going to bombard for roughly 24 hours Fort Morgan. This is late August. And this is going to be a quick bombardment, an intense bombardment, but it will be quick, relatively quick, and that will be it. Page and the Confederates in there will capitulate by the end of August. And by the end of August, the mouth of Mobile Bay is sealed off. But because Mobile Bay is sealed off, there's no need to go take out the city. That's why it falls on April 12th of 1865. We have sealed off the second busiest blockade running port in the Confederacy, and we didn't even have to take the city.
So,
and that's succinct for Kris White.
That was actually an excellent answer. So we'll save the Battle of Fort Blakely for later, but to just briefly, if someone goes to visit Mobile and wants to see these sites, they can go to the sites of Spanish Fort, Fort Blakely. What else can folks see around Mobile for Civil War history?
I mean, Forts Gaines and Morgan are both there. They're really awesome. Our friends down at Fort Gaines are, they've treated us really well over the last few years as we put together the Teacher Institute and some other things. We were just down there filming ourselves for the American Battlefield Trust. Great site. It's at the very tip of Dauphin Island. Then you can jump on a ferry and go across to Fort Morgan. It's actually a really neat thing to do, is take the ferry across. It takes roughly 45 minutes. Goes across the mouth of the bay, and you get to actually get a different view of the quote unquote battlefield. You can get a good view of Mobile Bay. Fort Morgan is there. Then if you go into the city, like you mentioned, there's just on the east bank of the bay, you have Spanish Fort. There's not much left there at Spanish Fort, but man, is it an impressive fortification. It's up inside of a housing plan. You really got to climb a hill. So if you have mobility issues, it might not be the place to go. But Mike Bunn over at Fort Blakely State Park is it's awesome.
Wow.
He's done a lot of work. He's worked with the American Battlefield Trust. He does a lot of work down there. Blakely was a town created in 1814 by Josiah Blakely. He's from Connecticut. Blakely goes down there to try to rival Mobile. That was his idea, and now it's a ghost town. And it's really neat. They're kind of putting together these ghost structures for you. There's no ghosts themselves, but the outlines of buildings and things to give you an idea. They have an awesome boat that you can take out with them. They have tours that go up and down the Tensaw, and they'll actually take you all the way up to 27 Mile Bluff to go see the old site of Mobile. And then if you head downtown, Mobile History Center is fantastic. If you want to learn about Mardi Gras, there's a carnival museum down there. So there's a lot more there than I think meets the eye. And Fort Condy's down there. That's part of the Mobile History Center. Just a really cool place. And if you get into downtown Mobile, it's largely untouched by the hard hand of war. People will say, "Oh, look at these modern buildings. The Yankees probably burned them down." Actually, they didn't. There were a ton of fires in Mobile. There were 5 historic fires, like one in 1820, one in the 1830s, one in the 1890s, early 1900s, 1904 or 5, 1919, tons of fires that had nothing to do with the American Civil War. But there are still historic houses down there. Unfortunately, downtown Mobile at the time, it had the war had 24 churches, 2 synagogues, a floating church for the sailors, had a Catholic church down there. It had 4 newspapers, 4 newspapers. There's not even a daily newspaper down there now. Amongst other things, they had the very impressive Battle House Hotel. There's no battle that took place there, but it's named after John Battle, who created the hotel. It burned too on I think it was Valentine's Day in 1905, and it's been rebuilt. It's an awesome place. So there's a lot to see and do, and it's where Stephen Douglas spent the night of the election of 1860. Stephen Douglas, made famous prior to the war, and Lincoln Douglas debates. He wins Mobile County, and his essentially campaign manager, a guy named John Forsyth, ran a newspaper in Mobile, and he went down there, spent the time with Forsyth, gave a speech, and stayed at the old Battle House before it burned down, obviously, the night before the election of 1860.
One of the things that I think that the Mobile History Center does really well too is there had been statue downtown of Raphael Semmes, the Confederate naval commander, that they put inside the History Center and recontextualize it. You get to sort of interact with that statue in a really interesting way. And, with all of the monument controversies that went on a couple of years ago, I thought this was an excellent solution to do something that really educates and contextualizes that. I was also surprised. This was a neat treat for me. Braxton Bragg is buried in Mobile, Alabama, in a beautiful cemetery.
Yeah, Magnolia Cemetery is there. Magnolia has probably more than 100,000 people buried in it. It's massive. It's more than 100 acres. It was on the edge of the city. Today it's, inside of the city. There's Mobile National Cemeteries there. And it's really, between Pensacola and New Orleans, it's probably the most impressive cemetery if you're going along the Gulf Coast. Well worth the time. Braxton Bragg's there. They have a monument to the Hunley crew. There's a member of the CSS Alabama that was buried there inside the cemetery. There's 3,100-ish Confederates buried in the Confederate section. Don't quote me on that. There's some really neat memorialization inside of there, but also just inside of the civilian part of the cemetery. I mean, some really beautiful memorial stones and things. It's well worth a drive out there. I will warn people, if you do go out there, the footing can be very tricky at times. It's very soft soil, and if it rains, it's going to turn into a swamp at different points of that cemetery, because it sits low. But that's a neat one. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. So Mobile, not that we are being paid, but visit Mobile.
And go to visitmobile.com.
So Kris, thanks for spending some time in Mobile Bay with us tonight.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for enjoying my ramblings this evening.
I'm Kris Mackowski for Kris White. Thanks for being with us on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We will see you online and on the battlefield.